I'm Mr. Beats. It's okay. You can come a little closer. Okay, that's too close. Too close. Much better. Anyway, when I was 18 years old, I had to register for the draft. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the draft, aka military conscription, is the process in which all male American citizens have to be ready to become soldiers and fight in a war, whether they want to or not. Indeed-a-roo, all American males aged 18 to 25 must register with the Selective Service System in case the country goes to war and runs out of voluntary soldiers. The last time there was a draft? 1973. My dad missed the draft by 3 years. I missed the draft by 26 years. But my dad volunteered to become a soldier, serving in the Army. In my opinion, he timed it pretty well, joining the Army about 1 year after a particularly horrendous war ended that killed as many as 3.8 million people, including 58,220 Americans. It was a proxy war, or a war in which two major powers used too much smaller powers to fight against each other in order to avoid fighting each other directly. It was a war that not only divided a country but divided the world. It was so controversial that it was the first war to cause a significant number of Americans to literally stop trusting their own government. It almost single-handedly destroyed the reputation of this guy. It was the first war the United States clearly lost. Here's the story of the Vietnam War, arguably the most controversial war in American history. Once upon a time, there was a group of people called the Vietnamese who lived here in mainland Southeast Asia, an area commonly referred to as Indochina. Eventually, the Chinese began to influence and straight up take over much of the area. Flash forward to the 1800s, and France had conquered the area and maintained full control of it until World War II. Most people don't know that the Vietnam War was actually 3 separate wars that began right after World War II ended. But I'm a bit ahead of myself. By the 1930s, several Vietnamese were just sick and tired of French rule, and various revolutionary groups organized to plan to overthrow French rule. One such group was the Viet Minh, who not only pushed for Vietnamese independence from the French, but also the Japanese, who are now all up in Southeast Asia's business. Ah yes, the Viet Minh, a group of communists led by a dude named Ho Chi Minh. He had been exiled from mainland Southeast Asia for most of his life, but now was back, baby, trying to lead a revolution inspired, at least partially, by the United States? Throughout World War II, the Viet Minh had got aid from the United States, as well as the Soviet Union and China. American President Franklin Roosevelt was a big supporter of Vietnamese resistance and argued Vietnam should be given independence after the war was over. Well, FDR died. And after the war ended, the French did not grant Vietnam independence, and this led to, another war. Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces went underground to fight it. Quite literally, actually. Because they didn't have the same advanced weapons the French had, they dug tunnels underground as part of their broader strategy of conducting guerrilla warfare, or a war fought by unconventional means. They often hid in the jungle and launched ambushes, or surprise attacks from concealed positions. By early 1946, French, Japanese, and British forces all teamed up to defeat the Viet Minh. But after the Japanese and British left, the Viet Minh started rebelling again. Not only that, they were recruiting, and their numbers were dramatically growing. Though the French were eventually able to regain control of Indochina, for several years the whole area was unstable and hundreds of thousands of people died. Not only that, both sides committed a bunch of war crimes. This period came to be known as the First Indochina War, aka the Anti-French Resistance War. Meanwhile, after it became clear that the Viet Minh were straight up communists, the United States was like, I guess we have to fight against you, and started secretly aiding the French. In the spring of 1954, the Viet Minh had a decisive victory over the French in what became known as the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It was a huge morale booster for the Viet Minh and a major blow for the French. By then, the United States was freaking out about communism spreading around the world, and many in the American government thought that they should send not only troops, but nukes to France to help them defeat the Viet Minh. Ever since Harry Truman was president, the U.S. had a foreign policy of, quote, containment. It basically assumed that the Soviet Union would always be trying to expand its influence, and so the United States and other, quote, democratic countries had to do whatever they could to contain this influence. In other words, democracy good, communism bad, stop communism, and spread democracy whenever possible. This thinking is ultimately what led to the U.S. fighting in the Korean War. It was a devastating war that ended in a stalemate. Actually, that stalemate is still in place today. Regardless, the US had prevented South Korea from becoming communist, likely inspired by holding back the spread of communism on the Korean peninsula. The next American president, Dwight Eisenhower, warned that once one country, quote, fell to communism, that country's neighbor surely would, quote, fall to it next. There was even a name for that theory, the domino theory, that said Eisenhower didn't want to make the mistake again of sending in American troops on the ground to fight and proxy wars against the Soviet Union. You know, like Truman did in Korea? Nah, man. So while communism spreading across Indochina did freak Eisenhower out, he wasn't about to send troops there. However, after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French were now looking for a way out. At the 1954 Geneva Conference, not to be confused with the Geneva Conventions, that's something entirely different, diplomats from France, the Viet Minh, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and the United States all agreed to temporarily divide up Indochina. Ah, there you go. There's a map of it. They created the country of Laos. Ah, they made it landlocked. How lovely. They created Cambodia. Hi, Cambodia. And finally, they created two Vietnams, divided at the 17th parallel. Up here, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, aka North Vietnam, and down here, the State of Vietnam, which eventually morphed into the Republic of Vietnam, aka South Vietnam. There were supposed to be elections held in 1956 to create a unified Vietnamese government. Those elections never happened, and a big reason why they never happened was because of this dude, John Foster Dulles, the U.S. Secretary of State. He objected to elections probably because he knew that any election would likely put communists in charge of all of Vietnam. Dulles' brother, Allen Dulles, who was in charge of the CIA at the time, then engaged in some straight-up psyop. He spread propaganda that said the Viet Minh were persecuting Roman Catholics, saying stuff like, they buried a priest alive. In response, hundreds of thousands of Catholics in North Vietnam fled to the south. The United States helped them flee. Hey, speaking of Catholics, No Dinh Diem, a Catholic who hated communists, proclaimed himself the first president of South Vietnam. Okay. Diem held a referendum to see if he would be president or not. And would you look at that? He got 98.2% of the vote. Wow, that's impressive. And even more impressive, he got 133% of the vote in Saigon. Ha! Woo! Didn't know that was mathematically possible, but great job, Diem. Yeah, he would rule the country with an iron fist. Soon after taking power, he started a, quote, denounce the communists campaign, a campaign in which anyone who even slightly became associated with being communist or anti-Diem was arrested, tortured, or even executed. Yep, you could get the death penalty for just being a communist. And despite being a corrupt dictator who basically persecuted anyone in South Vietnam who wasn't Catholic, the American government stood by him for several years. Meanwhile, in North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, as well as other politicians, also often got, well, would you look at that, 99% of the vote. While the United States viewed Ho Chi Minh as a brutal dictator, to many Vietnamese, he at least looked like a better dude than Diem. Still, the North Vietnamese government was oppressive, often seizing farmland and also executing at least thousands of those who went against them. By the end of the 1950s, there was a new rising movement against the South Vietnamese government, much of it within South Vietnam, but it also grew in nearby Laos and Cambodia. It was called the Liberation Army of South Vietnam, but newspapers called it the, quote, Viet Cong, which is shortened from Vietnam Cong San, which translates to Vietnamese communist. The Viet Cong got support from North Vietnam, especially after North Vietnam invaded Laos to help communists there. How did that support get down to the Viet Cong? Well, a network of roads and trails running through both Laos and Cambodia down to South Vietnam, simply referred to as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, made the Viet Cong stronger than ever. In 1960, a dude named Le Duan led North Vietnam, and he'd be more aggressive to South Vietnam than Ho Chi Minh ever was. Despite not wanting to send troops, President Eisenhower did send some military, quote, advisors, weapons, and money to South Vietnam, but not much. And by the time he left office, it appeared that the United States may not stick around South Vietnam after all. But then this dude, wait a second, where's he at? Oh, there he is. But then this dude, John F. Kennedy, took over as president. Kennedy sent more and more military advisors, weapons, and money to South Vietnam, despite the French General Charles de Gaulle warning him that a war in Vietnam would lead the United States into a, quote, bottomless military and political swamp. Still, Kennedy thought it'd look really bad if South Vietnam fell to communism.
The United States has been assisting Vietnam economically to maintain its independence and viability, and also has sent training groups out there, which have been expanded in recent weeks as the attacks on the government and on the people of South Vietnam have increased. Now, this is an area where there is a good deal of danger, and it's a matter of information. We don't want to have information which is of assistance to the enemy, and it's a matter which I think will have to be worked out with the government of Vietnam, which bears the primary responsibility.
On May 8, 1963, more than 3,000 Buddhists gathered in Hue to protest a government ban on flying the Buddhist flag on the Buddha Day. South Vietnamese security forces fired guns and threw grenades at the protesters, ultimately killing 9 unarmed Buddhist civilians. This led to mass protests against Diem by Buddhists across the country. They asked Diem to give them the right to practice their religion freely, but Diem refused. Things got tense in Saigon, South Vietnam's capital, in June when Buddhist monks began burning themselves alive. Here, in a photograph by Malcolm Brown, is the most famous example. A monk named Thich Quan Duc burned himself alive at a busy Saigon intersection. Many of you might recognize this picture from an album cover by Rage Against the Machine. President Kennedy later said that no photograph, quote, in history has generated so much emotion around the world as that one. Speaking of Kennedy, he was about done with South Vietnam. and Diem in particular. South Vietnamese generals told the Kennedy administration they'd be staging a coup, or an illegal overthrow of a government, of the Diem regime. The Kennedy administration said they wouldn't stop them if they tried. On November 1st, 1963, they arrested Diem and assassinated him the next day. South Vietnam would have political instability for years afterward, led by a series of generals in and out of power. There is substantial evidence that Kennedy was ready to get Americans out of Vietnam after this. But, yeah, this didn't actually happen. Maybe it would have happened, but we'll never know, as Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd. I have an entire video about the assassination of JFK. Okay, you already know about the video. Great. But in case you don't know, check it out, maybe? But yeah, this led to Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson, being sworn in as the next president. Johnson had little foreign policy experience. While he wasn't a big fan of American involvement in Vietnam, like Kennedy, he also thought it looked really bad if South Vietnam fell to communism. While he was cool with the US government continuing to carry out more covert operations there, he was against sending ground forces. At least he didn't want to send ground forces yet. (1964) was an election year, and Lyndon Johnson didn't want to appear weak on foreign policy, especially after his main opponent, Barry Goldwater, was talking trash about Johnson, saying that he was too weak against communism. So he put the pressure on North Vietnam by putting American ships all up in their business. On August 2nd, an American destroyer named the USS Maddox was hanging out off the coast of North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin when it spotted North Vietnamese torpedo boats. It fired a warning shot, and the torpedo boats fired shots back at them. 2 days later, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox again. Just kidding. That never happened. But here's the thing, the sailors on the USS Maddox thought they were being attacked, but nope, they weren't being attacked at all. Regardless, based on this made-up attack, President Johnson ordered an air attack on North Vietnamese naval bases and asked Congress to grant him the power to take any action necessary to fight back against North Vietnamese aggression and defend South Vietnam. Congress passed what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7th, 1964. The House passed it unanimously, 416-0. The Senate passed it 88-2. The only two U.S. senators voting against it were Wayne Morse and Ernest Greening, who said he didn't like, quote, sending our American boys into combat in a war in which we have no business, which is not our war, into which we have been misguidedly drawn, which is steadily being escalated. Johnson said the resolution was like, quote, grandma's nightshirt because it, quote, covered everything. He considered it a blank check to commit American forces to Vietnam. And boy, oh boy, did he send American forces to Vietnam. Under the advice of the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who also served under JFK, Johnson increased the number of military advisors in Vietnam to 23,000. And yet, Johnson, or LBJ as many call him today, assured Americans he wasn't going to send troops on the ground shortly before the election of 1964. Well, that all changed after the election was over. LBJ easily won the election. That was an understatement. It was the most lopsided presidential election in American history in terms of the popular vote. And shortly afterward, things began to quickly escalate. After the Viet Cong attacked an American airbase at Pleiku, killing 8 Americans, Johnson ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign of North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder would continue for 3 years. During that time, the United States dropped around 800 tons of bombs a day on North Vietnam. And yet, But it didn't seem to faze North Vietnam. They continued to aid the Viet Cong via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In order to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail supply route, the United States also bombed Laos, which itself was going through a civil war. Curtis LeMay, the chief of staff of the U.S. Air Force, wrote, quote, "We're going to bomb them back into the Stone Age." But all this bombing didn't seem to have much of an effect, as most of the bombs failed to hit their targets, instead falling into empty jungles. Not only that, Viet Cong guerrilla fighters just kept going underground anyway, building elaborate tunnels to shelter from the bombs. And so, President Johnson did what once was unthinkable. He sent ground troops. Like, a lot of ground troops. By the end of 1965, more than 184,000 American troops were now in Vietnam. By the end of 1966, more than 385,000. By the end of 1967, more than 485,000. By the end of 1968, more than 536,000. Holy dang. And in case you were wondering where these soldiers were coming from, many of them did not volunteer to go fight in Vietnam. They were drafted. Nearly 1.9 million men would be drafted to serve in the Vietnam War. Most of those drafted were poor. Rich people often found ways to get out of the draft. You know, they made up stories about medical conditions or went to college when they didn't have to. The American soldiers were originally supposed to train South Vietnamese troops, but yeah, that was a disaster. The South Vietnamese soon were becoming more like spectators in their own war as Americans did more and more of the fighting. The leading commander of the American forces in Vietnam was General William Westmoreland, who hoped to take out both North Vietnam and the Viet Cong through a war of attrition, or a military strategy of attempting to simply wear down the enemy until the enemy loses their will to fight. But yeah, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong weren't about to lose their will to fight. In fact, as more Americans came, the Viet Cong recruitment numbers went up. Soldiers on both sides fought in some pretty miserable conditions. It was often rainy. When it wasn't rainy, it was humid. There were poisonous snakes, swarms of weaver ants with stinging bites, giant centipedes, crocodiles, tigers. Oh my! The Viet Cong didn't have the military technology of the United States, but they made their own bombs, set up booby traps, and hid in the jungle, waiting for American soldiers to fall in their traps. The dense jungle foliage made it easy for the Viet Cong to camouflage not just themselves, but also their bases. They'd launch ambushes on American soldiers, then quickly retreat back into the jungle. To counter the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, General Westmoreland conducted search and destroy missions in villages, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Americans in low-flying helicopters would spray machine gun bullets over an area, and then ground troops would move in quickly to search out and kill the enemy. Sometimes these missions took out Viet Cong bases. Other times these missions just destroyed villages and killed civilians who had nothing to do with the Viet Cong. This led to more and more villagers to stop trusting Americans. Not only that, to deal with the thick jungles that concealed the Viet Cong, the U.S. Air Force began spraying herbicides like Agent Orange to kill all vegetation. Sure, the herbicides cleared the jungles, but they also ended up later causing all kinds of health problems for people exposed to them. During the war, the Air Force ultimately sprayed at least 19 million gallons of herbicides in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Even today, both veterans and regular folks in these countries are still suffering from the effects of herbicides. In particular, Agent Orange has put millions of people at a higher risk of getting cancer.
We have helped to build, and we have helped to defend. Thus, over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence. And I intend to keep that promise.
Publicly, Johnson was making it seem like, oh yeah, South Vietnam was going to be an independent country soon, any day now.
Such peace demands an independent South Vietnam.
But by 1966, many South Vietnamese soldiers had deserted the fight. To put it mildly, things were not going so well for the United States. Many around the world began to question why the heck Americans were even in Vietnam anymore. Some of the biggest protests were actually back home in the United States. Beginning in 1966, huge protests erupted on college campuses across the country. By 1967, these protests seemed to be everywhere. Some protesters were upset that the United States was bombing the crap out of an undeveloped country. Some protesters called it a war of imperialism. Many protesters said the war was simply not winnable. Other protesters just thought the draft was wrong. It became common to see young people burning their draft cards in protest. They particularly talked trash about the fact that rich and powerful people voted for the war while poor people actually fought it. A big reason why many Americans began to turn against the war is because they saw what the war actually looked like in real time on TV. And it looked like a nightmare. While the Johnson administration would give press conferences pretending everything was all gravy, news coverage on TV routinely showed children killed by American bombs and dying American soldiers. People weren't falling for what their government was telling them anymore. You know, it's kind of like the government telling you that there's no war crimes, and then you get on TikTok and you see the war crimes, and then the government bans TikTok. Problem solved. Anyway, it's important to recognize that many Americans still defended and supported the war effort. Those who became known as Hawks wanted total victory in Vietnam, while those who wanted to stop the war and bring the troops home became known as Doves. It was arguably the first time the country was so divided on one particular issue, going back all the way to the American Civil War. Tragically, many of the Vietnam War veterans who did survive and came back home got no love. Many of these veterans had dads who returned home from World War II greeted as heroes. Vietnam War veterans were often not greeted at all when they got home. Anti-war protesters sometimes harassed them. They didn't spit on them, though. Apparently that's a myth. By the end of 1967, despite his impressive domestic accomplishments regarding civil rights and social welfare programs, President Johnson was not that popular anymore. Yes, they really shouted that. And yet, he insisted on finishing the job, even as others around him now had doubts. One of those who had big doubts? Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Once a big supporter of the war, he ended up resigning in protest of it, and spent the rest of his life saying the Vietnam War was a mistake. Still, the war dragged on, with no clear victory in sight. And then, suddenly, on January 31st, 1968, which was the first day of Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, both North Vietnam and Viet Cong forces launched a huge coordinated attack on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns. All at once. It became known as the Tet Offensive, and it ended up being one of the biggest military campaigns of the war. The Tet Offensive was a rare time when both North Vietnam and the Viet Cong went on, offense, and it caught many Americans and South Vietnamese by surprise. In Hue, the same city where the Buddhist uprisings had taken place 5 years prior, intense fighting took place that destroyed most of the buildings there. While the United States and South Vietnam were eventually able to defeat North Vietnam and the Viet Cong during the Tet Offensive, it caused more people around the world to turn against the war. One poll showed that now just 26% of the public approved of how President Johnson was handling it. Based mostly on how badly the war was going, he decided to not commit more troops, even though General Westmoreland had requested an additional 206,000 troops. Johnson also chose not to run for re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
two notable anti-war candidates ran to take his place for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. Eugene McCarthy, a U.S. Senator representing Minnesota, and Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy and now U.S. Senator representing New York. After Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, yeah, he got assassinated too, some of his supporters switched to support McCarthy. Despite McCarthy winning more votes than any other Democratic presidential candidate, the party elites went with Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, instead. This led to a bunch of anti-war Democrats getting pretty angry as Humphrey had supported continuing the war effort. Outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, there were even violent confrontations between anti-war protesters and the police. Meanwhile, the Republican Party nominated Richard Nixon for president, the former vice president who once aggressively called for sending more troops to Vietnam and criticized Democrats for being too soft on Vietnam, but now was like, hey, I've got a, quote, secret plan to end the Vietnam War. Nixon also campaigned to end the draft. You could argue that this is one reason why he won the election of 1968. That said, after he took office, he didn't seem to be that much in a hurry to end the war. Besides, by that time, peace talks between North Vietnam and the United States had already begun in Paris anyway. After Nixon took over, he introduced a new strategy called Vietnamization, which basically meant gradually turning the war back over to South Vietnam. I mean, that was going to be hard. At the time, 1 out of every 12 South Vietnamese lived in a refugee camp, for crying out loud. In 1969, it had become increasingly clear that the American government was covering up bad stuff its military had been doing in Southeast Asia. Most infamously, what became known as the My Lai Massacre. It had occurred back in March 1968. American troops led by Lieutenant William Calley entered a small village called My Lai trying to find Viet Cong. Well, they didn't find any Viet Cong, but instead they sexually assaulted several women and rounded up around 500 unarmed civilians, including mostly women, children, elderly men, and even babies, and brutally murdered them. And then the US Army covered it up. It wasn't until November 1969 when word finally got out about it. Around that same time, Daniel Ellsberg published the Pentagon Papers, which revealed that the American military had secretly expanded military operations in Vietnam without telling the public or even Congress. Even though President Nixon wasn't mentioned in the Pentagon Papers, he viewed its release as an attack on his handling of the war. He made it a mission to take Ellsberg down, but ultimately most viewed Ellsberg as a heroic whistleblower, and long story short, he wouldn't see any prison time. While Nixon did begin bringing the troops home, protests continued as many Americans thought the process wasn't happening quickly enough. Plus, anti-war protesters got angry all over again after Nixon ordered American forces to invade Cambodia, an officially neutral country, on April 29, 1970. Nixon had not consulted Congress. At one of the protests on the campus of Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, on May 4th, National Guard members fired shots into a rowdy student crowd, killing 4 and wounding 9. Today, this horrific event is simply known as the Kent State shootings. And I have a video I made about that as well, which you can check out. It got demonetized, as this video is demonetized because, you know, I'm teaching you about bad stuff that happened in history. Despite growing pressure to end the war immediately, Nixon insisted on peace with honor. He sent his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, to secretly negotiate with the North Vietnamese government. Of utmost importance, getting the American prisoners of war released. By 1972, only around 24,000 American troops were still in Vietnam. Still, North Vietnam stayed aggressive, dropping a series of of bombs on South Vietnam in what became known as the Easter Offensive. In response, Nixon ordered more bombings on North Vietnam. Regardless, Nixon easily won re-election in a landslide victory in November. On January 27th, 1973, in what became known as the Paris Peace Accords, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States finally negotiated an agreement calling for all American troops to leave South Vietnam in exchange for the release of American prisoners of war. But this peace agreement smelled much more like an American retreat. Meanwhile, Nixon had continued bombing Cambodia without getting approval from Congress. This ultimately was a big reason why Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, a law passed over Nixon's veto that required the president to report to Congress within 48 hours after committing troops to a military action or substantially increasing the size of American combat units. The law also said troops couldn't stay in combat somewhere for more than 60 days without further congressional approval. And then on March 15th, 1973, Nixon was like, look, North Vietnam, if you attack South Vietnam again, the United States might just go to war with you again.
Oh boy,
Well, goodness. Anyway, by then, most Americans were out of South Vietnam. By the end of 1974, North Vietnam was planning an attack on South Vietnam to completely take it over. Yep, in direct violation of the Paris Peace Accords. North Vietnamese troops moved into South Vietnam in March 1975 and captured Saigon on April 30th, 1975. The fall of Saigon, as it became to be known, marked not only the end of the Vietnam War, but the end of South Vietnam as a country. The communists had taken over all of Vietnam. Yeah, so, was it worth it? Well, many say no. The Vietnam War was the longest war in American history up to that point, only surpassed by the war in Afghanistan in 2021, lasting 6 months longer. The war dramatically hurt the reputation of the United States. It hurt, the United States quite a bit too. Today, the Vietnam War is seen as pointless, a big freaking mistake, based on lies that led to millions of innocent people dying. It was a civil war that many say the United States had no business being a part of. Unlike the Korean War, the United Nations wanted nothing to do with it. Most of the world refused to help the United States at all. It left more than 58,000 American soldiers dead, and another more than 153,000 wounded. Many of those veterans who survived suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. These vets often came home ignored, sometimes even despised. The war was also an environmental disaster. It devastated the forests of Southeast Asia. So many 18, 19, and 20-year-olds died fighting the war that Congress ratified the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. It was only during the 1990s when relations got better between the United States and Vietnam. Today, the two countries are just fine with each other, despite Vietnam still being, quote, communist. Go figure, huh? Look, the United States was not used to losing wars. A smaller and way less powerful country defeating a great superpower such as the US was shocking. It was so demoralizing that the United States avoided getting involved in foreign wars afterward, mostly because the American public demanded that they not get involved. There's even a term for it: Vietnam Syndrome. Only after 9/11 did that finally change, and even then, the American government at least attempted to avoid sending ground troops. Oh, and it didn't reinstate the draft. Needless to say, I didn't join the military after high school. Only recently did I realize that a big reason why I didn't volunteer for the military was because of my obsession with the Vietnam War when I was 18. I blame all those Vietnam War movies I used to watch. I didn't want to get stuck in a jungle somewhere, constantly afraid of being ambushed. I didn't want to shoot and kill random villagers. I think it's safe to say that if I graduated from high school in 1960 instead of 2000, I would have been much more likely to volunteer to serve in the military. But in 2000, I suppose I had Vietnam syndrome. I'm sorry, Dad. Folks, I've been told that I have hair on my face and I need to get rid of it. So breaking news, I have found a new razor by Henson. We're gonna try this sucker out. Look at that thing. Woo-wee. This razor is made to freaking aerospace standards. In other words, it's made with very high standards. This gives you a smooth and safe shave. The precision of it allows the razor to hold the blade at an optimal 30-degree angle. Oh yeah, that feels different. It's good. Never used a razor like this before. I like it. I like it. Feels like you're not even shaving. No irritation. No joke. I'm not just saying this because they're a sponsor, okay? This is real. Also, using this razor is better for the environment. No joke. The Henson AL13 is completely plastic free, as is Henson's packaging. Most importantly, in the long term, you save money using Henson razors. The upfront cost might be more, but you're not thinking of the long-term cost of ownership, man. Once you own a Henson razor, it's only about $3 to $5 a year to shave, depending on how often you shave. So try it out for yourself. The link's in the description. So what war should I cover next? Or maybe you want me just to finally make that video comparing myself to Mr. Beast, because holy crap, I recently got 1 million subscribers. Thank you for subscribing. Also, did you know that I really exist? It's true, and you can see me in real life at some upcoming real life events. Find out more details at my website, IamMrBeat.com, and thanks for watching.